about this recent cholera outbreak in Yemen that you probably all heard quite a lot about it. So before trying to answer this question, I will go through a brief context of this of cholera in Yemen. Then I will discuss the data quality that we've been using for the analysis. And I will go to the modeling results and how they were used in practice. So on the graph below, what you can see is that with only 4 outbreaks of cholera reported between 1970 and 2015, cholera was not of major concern for Yemen until the recent massive outbreak that started in 2016 with more than 1.1 million cases reported so far. This outbreak unfolded against the backdrop of a war that started in 2015 and that basically made the bad situation even worse, in particular in terms of access for the population to improve water sources. Another consequence of this war is that there is very little research that was published on this topic. And that was maybe one of the first objectives of the study was to fill this gap and try to provide a detailed epidemiological description of this outbreak. In contrast to previous nationwide massive outbreaks like the one in Haiti that I represent here also, this outbreak in Yemen features a rather small case fatality risk of 0.2%. And another striking feature is this first small wave followed by this large second wave, which usually we see the opposite. So this really made us interested in trying to explain what factors drove this two-wave outbreak. We also tried to evaluate the risk and location of future waves, but I will not discuss this in this presentation. There is more detail in our recent publication in the Lancet Global Health. So why modeling this outbreak? The main reason is perhaps that many factors influence the dynamic of outbreak, and particular cholera, which makes things a bit complicated to understand. Usually we don't really understand what's going on, and because of the complex interaction between those factors. So models are a very simple representation of the reality that try to focus on the key factors and to test different hypotheses with the objective to explain and possibly predict the dynamic of the epidemic. Because of that, modeling is not just a theoretical exercise. It's actually require access to quality data to be able to confront model with reality. So in Yemen, we had access to extensive data. First, we collected the electronic line list for up to 25 cholera treatment centers run by MSF across all the country. But we also had access to the national database maintained by WHO, through which we had access to data from approximately 2,000 health facilities, including the one of MSF. We combine and clean this database, and that enables us to visualize the outbreak in real time, but also to do some analysis that we then provided back to the field and to the decision makers. So because we had 2 data sources, that was quite interesting because we could compare the data quality of these 2 sources. And as you can see on the top panel left here, so we don't have MSF data for the first wave, but on the second wave, we see that both national and MSF data show a peak around July. In terms of case fatality risk, we also see that the data is very consistent. There was a CFR above 0.5% during the increasing phase that quickly dropped to very low level after the peak of the second wave. And we also find out that there is a consistency in the proportion of children under 5 that has been increasing as well in both databases after the peak of the epidemic. So this indicates that there may be some overreporting, and this is quite common for cholera because the case definition is very sensitive but not very specific. Fortunately, we had access also to RDT, rapid diagnostic test, and culture results from the national database only. And there were quite a small proportion of the suspected cases that were tested by RDT and even less by culture, and the positivity rate changed over time. But we can use this data to try to provide a rough estimate of what the number of true cholera cases looks like. And what we found out is that if you compare on the left the time series of the reported cholera cases with the time series of estimated cases, you see that there is some overreporting, and in particular during the decreasing phase of the second wave. The first consequence of that is that probably the case fatality risk, the one that is reported, is probably an underestimate. But at the same time, we see that both epidemic shape are quite similar. That means that even if we have some underreporting, this data is obviously imperfect, but it's informative and it can be used for modeling. So, as I said before, modeling try to look at which factors are driving these two waves. And we need data, and so the first thing we did is we tried to look at rainfall data, because there is a long history of link between cholera and rainfall. So in this mirror plot, what you see is the time series of cholera and the time series of rainfall in Yemen. And what you see is that the first wave starts in October 2016, as is just after the end of the 2016 rainy season. And the first wave spread across the dry season, and you have still cases like even late during the first wave. And the second wave starts really as the rainy season restarts in late April 2017. And it keeps increasing. You have the Ramadan, it keeps increasing the Ramadan, and then it peaks just after Ramadan. It starts decreasing during the summer rain, still keep high. And when the summer rain stopped in September 2017, the epidemic, a number of cases dropped down to a lower level. So this graph indicates that there is a link, it seems obvious, between rainfall and cholera. And more precisely, we focus on the increasing phase of the second wave to try to use modeling to understand what factors influence this big surge of cases. So the first objective was to quantify the link between rainfall and cholera, both in time and space. In particular, we wanted to determine which districts were the most at risk of cholera transmission when the rainy season started. And finally, we wanted to test whether this whether the period of Ramadan, which was mainly dry, possibly was associated with an increased risk of cholera transmission. So we built a spatial-temporal model, and I won't provide details here, but it's at the district level on a daily resolution, and we try to incorporate the following factors. So first, we modeled a lag effect between the cumulative rainfall over 7 days and the effect on a risk of transmission of cholera over the next 10 days. Second, we add a time-specific component for the Ramadan in order to account for potential human behavioral changes during that period of time. And finally, we adjusted the model for specific vulnerability in different districts. In particular, there are some differences in access to improved water sources, level of malnutrition, or urbanization. So now we can quantify those factors with the model, and what we found is that there is this nonlinear association between weekly rainfall and the risk of cholera over the next 10 days. In particular, you see that the cholera transmission increased up to 42% following a week with 25 millimeters of rainfall compared with no rainfall. So that's this quantification that the model provides. When we combine this relative risk with rainfall data, we are able to identify which are the high-risk districts during the rainy season, and they are in dark here. And finally, we found out that cholera transmission increased by 19% during Ramadan compared to the preceding months after adjusting for rainfall. So what this is the first practical use of this model is to provide a likely explanation of what might happen in Yemen. So imagine you have the first wave that starts during the dry season, and what we found is that, albeit of limited size, it actually played a key role in seeding cholera across Yemen during the dry season, which was less favorable for cholera transmission. And in the map above, you see that also most of the south of Yemen was affected. There were also some districts in the north that were affected by the first wave. When the rain returned in April 2017, the model suggests that they trigger widespread transmission of cholera that led to the large second wave. What model doesn't tell us is how this exactly happened. And this is something that needs to be investigated in the field, but given the problems of access to improved water sources in Yemen, one hypothesis is that a large portion of the population had to use contaminated surface waters. Despite no rainfall, cholera transmission remained sustained during Ramadan period and dropped just afterwards. Again, the model doesn't tell us how exactly this happened, but one hypothesis is that this could be due to the large gathering for meals or more frequent use of potentially contaminated street food that need to be tested further. And finally, the summer rainy season seems to have less impact on cholera transmission, and this could be due to maybe the scale-up of control measures, for instance, wash interventions that tripled between May and July. And finally, well, there is likely that this period of rain coincided with the typical seasonality of other enteric diseases, and thus leading to maybe some over-reporting of non-cholera diarrhea cases during the decreasing phase of this second wave. So in conclusion, this study is an example of how models can help analyze imperfect surveillance data and provide some quantification. In particular, it's really important to perform rapid tests and culture confirmation, not just at the beginning and at the end, but all along an outbreak in order to be able to estimate the proportion of true cholera cases. In terms of future outbreak, we need to better account for the context of cholera emergence and re-emergence in order to anticipate the risk of a surge of cases when the conditions become more favorable to cholera transmission. And there's a plan to use modeling and rainfall projection to that. And finally, most importantly, this result of this work were used by MSF in order to enhance the preparedness in case of a third wave in Yemen in 2018, by the WASH cluster in order to identify districts most at risk of cholera transmission during the 2018 rainy season, and finally by WHO to establish a list of priority districts for a preventive vaccination campaign that started last month. So I would like to acknowledge the huge work of all the healthcare workers and staff of the cholera surveillance system in Yemen that collected this data in difficult circumstances due to the war. And I would like to thank MSF and also all the organizations that funded and supported this study, and also all the authors of the study that was recently published. And thank you all for listening.